全球的各位观众，大家好，欢迎来到谷雨书院第329期活动。我是今天的主持人伊利亚江雪。谷雨书院着眼全球，聚焦大格局、大风范的时代人物。我们希望用开阔的视野和丰富的角度，为大家呈现前所未有的中国形象和雍容书卷气。谷雨书院于2015年成立于旧金山湾区，致力于促进和丰富海外华人的精神生活。迄今为止，谷雨书院在旧金山湾区、洛杉矶、北京、上海等地举办了400多场线下文化交流分享活动。邀请为谷雨书院做过分享的嘉宾包括最牛历史老师袁腾飞，北京四中国际大学知名学者秦晖3年。疫情期间，谷雨书院也通过线上的方式，在 YouTube 频道深度采访数10位不同的精英嘉宾。我们接下来会为大家介绍更多更好的节目，也欢迎大家的关注和订阅。那我们今天请他将为大家提供一个新的角度，我们也将借助这位从语言天才演变成政治学者的知识累积，来多了解一些如今牵动着全世界人民关心的中俄关系。那么我们先有请乌娜教授给大家
非常感谢各位谷雨书院和探普读书会的朋友，非常感谢，我非常荣幸有机会今天跟大家谈到这些国际关系的问题。我先说到这儿而且我再说一句，我其实好久没讲过中文，所以请多多关照。谢谢。
乌娜教授的这个中文太好了，我们都听不出来您好久没讲中文，感觉是您日常语言呢。那乌娜教授呢，也在此为大家再次介绍一下，他是拉脱维亚特拉金斯大学中国研究中心主任，政治学博士、博导，擅长多种语言，精通中英俄文。他同时呢，也是多家国际学术研究机构以及跨区域联盟组织的成员，拉脱维亚国家事务中心研究中心新丝绸之路项目负责人，研究注重中国波罗的海国家的关系。而且他曾于人民大学的110周年学术活动中发表了题为《新的跨区域主义的中欧共同立场》的演讲。乌娜博士曾为斯坦福大学东亚研究中心高级访问学者，当代欧洲研究学术协会会员，欧洲智库合作网络的拉脱维亚代表，拉脱维亚外交部与中国及中东欧国家合作工作小组成员，是多家国际性学术及地缘组织的成员。他对中国的研究主要针对中国的跨区域多边合作倡议等等。那今天我们的活动呢，也是与探富读书会合办，一家出版社 OnePlus Books 协办。探富读书会是由一群热爱文学、艺术、影视、阅读和美食的会员们组成的读书团体，主要特色是持续邀请北美的华文作家、艺术家、收藏家等亲临与会，讨论作品以及分享创作的历程。举办多期以来，也成为了会员们工作生活之余的精神交流家园。而一家出版社作者队伍汇集了一流的作家、学者，出版物曾被哈佛、燕京、斯坦福、UC Berkeley、UBC 等一流高校图书馆，以及旧金山、洛杉矶、纽约、西雅图等大型公共图书馆收藏。我们也首先有请毕业于南开大学的社会学学者陈红丽老师为我们做一个简要的分享。
大家好，我叫陈红丽，曾经在南开大学社会学系读书，20多年前呢来到美国，在加州，非常偶然的机会呢，认识了乌娜，然后交流呢，我突然意识到，居然在这样一位精通中文，而且精通俄文，而且对中国文化的不光是文化，对音乐、美食，对中国的一切都非常感兴趣的朋友交流。赶巧乌娜呢到斯坦福来讲学，我们一起讲呢，希望大家能够一起去听他的讲座。但是呢，几乎所有人都错过了那个今天非常有幸能够请 到贪腐读书会和谷雨的这个活动，来为大家跟大家见面，同时呢提供一个非常感谢，而且非常感谢谷雨书院这样的大力支持。一个小小的有很多心血和付出，感谢大家。
好的，谢谢红丽老师。好，那我相信现在呢，大家已经就是急不可耐了哈，等不及要聆听我们乌娜老师解读中国与俄罗斯的一个完美不平衡关系。那我们呢就有请老师开始分享，也希望大家在分享之后呢多多提问，与我们在线交流。有请乌娜老师。
好，谢谢非常高兴，非常荣幸。那我先从我的目的和结论开始吧。其实我开始写这本书的时候，我最大的问题，经常向我们被媒体提问的提的一个问题，就是中国和俄罗斯这两国关系到底有多么密切？可能对贵方这个问题很简单，听起来没有什么深刻的，对吧？但是这里在欧洲，而且在美国也是经常接受媒体的采访，会听到这个问题：俄罗斯和中国是不是现在基本上是进入了这个联盟关系阶段呢？或者不是？我们如何来理解和解释这个新时代中俄全面战略协作伙伴关系呢？这到底意味着什么？这个有什么经济、政治、安全方面在内？那么我就开始做这个方面的研究，决定以我的这个方法。我本人来自这个话语分析的这个我是政治学家，也是话语分析者，所以我就靠我这个方法来决定来试图回复这个问题，所以两国的关系有多么密切。那我说了，我要从我的目的和我的结论开始。那这就是我的目的。我的结论呢？结论是反正话语上有非常高的、非常强的支持。但是实际上最大的问题是缺少信任。那我来多介绍一下我这个结论是怎么来的。其实所以我的目的就是探查这个中俄关，不知道能不能这么说，探查，不好意思，如果这个词用的不对，请抱歉。所以探查中俄关系，我用的概念是完美的不平衡。那这个概念听起来很奇怪，其实没有什么道理，但是反正它是个应用的概念，并不是来自那个政治学，而是来自网游行业。可能这里各位朋友当中也有不少这个网游行业的代表，不知道，但是据我所知可能是有的，所以我如果在胡说呢，请抱歉。但是据我所知，就是这个 perfect imbalance 完美的不平衡，它是一种概念，一种方法。怎么解释呢？那请各位想想，有一种网络游戏。有一些玩家，他们玩的时间特别久，他们已经变得非常的强，他们有武器、有装备，什么都有，所以其实基本上是特别的就是强啊。他们一开始做什么就会赢的。那如果情况是这样的话，新的玩家没有对这种游戏对新的玩家没有什么吸引力。所以他们也不会加入，那这个对这个网游公司也不是好处，这也不是好事情。所以呢，有这样的一个完美的不平衡，意思是说，新的玩家，不管是多么娇弱，他还是有自己的优势，他有赢的机会，而且最强的、最经验最长的玩家，他可以输，他天天都要想到我能输，我不管多么强，我还是可以输的。那么我觉得为什么这个概念非常 能代表俄罗斯和中国的关系呢？因为经常有一种说法，就是中国和俄罗斯的关系不平衡，中国比俄罗斯强，人口也多，就经济上也比俄罗斯强得多。但是我还是认为这种合作里面，俄罗斯还是有这样的机会，所以我们不能以强弱的这个角度来分析这个关系。所以这个关系是不是对称不对称，其实这个问题是提的不对。我是怎么开始做这个方面的研究呢？有几个方向，也有几个案例，我选了几个案例。那首先我已经提到过，我是这个话语分析者，所以我以这个为入口点，以两国的总统、主席、外交部长、国防部长、总理等，就是外交领导的讲话分析为入口点，开始分析到底这两国的领导他们如何来介绍两国之间的双方关系。所以我主要的工具是文本。所以我开始看这些文本，这些讲话，很快发现有3个非常出色的，非常就是一下子能看到的合作的就是战略叙述吧。这些战略叙述我们可以把它们叫做故事嘛。那第一个这样的故事就是好朋友的故事，就是习近平和普京的个人友谊，这样的互方的次数多，一起过时间，一起靠煎饼，一起看冰球，这样的一些信息。这是第一个。那我先说这3个，接下来呢说这3个故事，这3个战略叙述到底有哪些不同和哪些共同点。所以这是第一个。所以这个个人友谊不是国家与国家的，而是特别强调2个领导的个人友谊，这是第一个。第二个呢第二个就是一种承诺，就是中国向俄罗斯承诺高附加值合作，技术上的合作，这个经济方面，所以这也是未来的一种，就是说我们将要这样合作，这是第二个故事。第3个故事呢，第3个故事跟欧亚经济不好意思，跟那个欧亚联通愿景有关系。中国的这个欧亚联通愿景我们都很了解，都听说过，至少就是最起码的是听说过的，就是一带一路。但是俄罗斯也有自己的，其实当然没有这样，就是不是了解的不是很多，但是有一种叫欧亚经济联盟。那么普京在北京参加一带一路的各种活动和论坛的时候，他看起来是说俄罗斯作为一带一路的成员国，但是实际上不是，他是讲的是自己的这个联盟，自己的想法，自己的欧亚联通计划。那这3个故事有哪些共同点呢？他们都跟这个人性有关系。第一个，好朋友，领导是好朋友，他是为了让俄罗斯和中国的国民发现，其实这个关系是稳定的，是可靠的，因为它是靠我们领导的一种友谊。那这个很清楚，也没有什么大的研究价值在内。那第二个故事呢， 更有趣。第二个就是说承诺高附加值的合作，这个跟俄罗斯对中国，对俄罗斯人对中国的一些想法有关系。那么可能你们知道，俄罗斯认为，就是按照我们给俄罗斯人口经常认为中国是靠俄罗斯的就是想用俄罗斯，不是一个可靠的合作伙伴，而是一种就是想把俄罗斯的能源买起来用，给自己用，所以这经常又是跟信任有关系。所以讲这个故事说我们真的认为俄罗斯的这个技术发展水平很高，所以我们可以在这个方面找一些合作这些合作项目，这就是为了又在俄罗斯人的眼里提高这个人性。那第三个故事呢，跟这些两个不同的就是不同的愿景，但是有时候说是一致的，有时候说是不同的，又是为了提高这样的一个人性。那么这个我不多讲了，但是我也说了，就我们可以那个问答的时候再深一点的解释。但是反正我工作的第二个部分是以立案为本，看到底这些故事实际上有没有什么就是讲的内容和实际上的合作的内容有没有区别，是一致的或者不是。那么我这些案例包括好几个，包括北极的合作，包括外太空的合作，包括这个有中亚国家互动，有什么就在中亚国家中国和俄罗斯的经证和合作有哪些发展方面。还有一个特别有趣的，对我也其实很难写出这个案例特别难。我说的是这个关于越南的案例，就是越南如何试图靠俄罗斯来制衡中国。刚才有人问我是不是俄罗斯人，我不是俄罗斯人，我是欧洲人但是我们以后我可以更多讲一下我的这个背景。好的，再说，所以这个越南对我来说还是比较有趣。这个例子我又看了一下印度，印度在这个俄罗斯、中国和印度这个三角形的一些关系。那么而且我的编辑，因为我写这本书是2020年，所以我的编辑说，那要不你还是看看这个新冠病毒对两国的双方关系有什么影响。那这个我也写了，我其实觉得我这个内容不是最好的，但是还是因为这是第一波的吧，因为当时做一些大的这些结论还早呢，但是也看了一下。那么所以我看了这些案例以后，在所有的这些方面能看到有一些合作故事，有这个团结一致的想法，但是实际上合作还差得远。那么在实际的日常合作中仍然缺少互信。而我开始讲的时候说，这个西方媒体经常问我是不是中国和俄罗斯现在可以说是联盟关系，are they allies or are they partners？ 是伙伴还是联盟？我回答这个问题一定说很确定的说不，这个不是联盟关系，因为缺少这个韧性。但是将来当然我们如果但是这个问题其实有第二部分。 俄罗斯入侵乌克兰的时候，乌克兰以后，中国这个所谓的中立态度，在西方，包括在我的国家，包括在欧洲，被看成实际上是一种支持俄罗斯的态度，而不是中立态度，对吧？所以我觉得可能因为我的书出版的是俄罗斯入侵乌克兰之前，所以现在可能情况已经变了。我觉得这些事情，就是这个战争，而且最近的一些政治信息也把这两个国家拉得更近，所以现在可能我书的这个结论，它要更新，也要加一些新的内容，也要更新。所以这个我想提到。
不好意思打扰一下，
OK，
就是我知道您在准备的时候可能有英文也有中文，如果有一些 topic 你觉得英文更好去解释，也可以说一些英文的，这个没有关系，不需要一直是中文，我们可以在待会儿交流的时候在中文也可以如果讲到有一些 topic 你是想用的也是可以的。
行非常感谢，谢谢，可以这样。但我其实已经讲完了，我也不想用1个小时讲，我就想我们还是给问答留多一点时间，这样可能更有趣。但是您如果觉得这样不好，就我也可以讲，我可以讲可以不讲，听您的。
没有，您先分享，因为我们现在在线的很多观众都是期待您的分享，因为我们之前也有做预告，所以我们还是期待您先分享一下，就语言都 OK， 就您可以先还是分享一下您这边的
好的，好，那好，那我就用英语讲吧，因为这2年反正我经常用的，我看的是
没问题
sorry，
没问题。
给我水吗？谢谢。我现在真的已经这2年就用中文交流的很少，所以非常高兴有今天的机会，而且也很就是希望我们以后可以谈到这些。All right，
还有一个就是
yes，
就是如果您有看见有问题的话，就是您可以现在不用回答，待会儿我们有专门的交流时间，所以现在大家可以提问，没有问题打到公屏上，但是待会儿我们会统一回复。好，你可以开始。
OK， 好，明白了，谢谢不好意思，没有理解对，行all right, so then I will switch to English and I will perhaps go back to the major findings, although I've already more or less described them. I would like to take a look at some of the cases. Sorry. 我现在用的是新电脑，所以找不到
Just take your time. No problem.
Sorry. Okay.
.我们线上的观众如果有任何的问题，也可以随时打到公屏上，待会儿我们会统一回复。
So, like I said at the beginning of the talk, the central ambition of the book was to inspect the current China-Russia partnership. And when I say current, of course, I mean prior to the Russian invasion into Ukraine, because that was when the book was published, to search for this answer to actually what I believe is the #1 question, not only in Eurasia, but actually globally, how close is Putin's Russia and sees China really getting? Well, and like I said, I started off as a discourse analyst to see what the foreign policy establishments say about this relationship. It's about, of course, we cannot know everything, but the speeches are a pretty good telltale sign as to how the countries frame each other. So like I said, I'm a discourse analyst. I'm not a critical discourse analyst. There are different schools of discourse analysis, but the main idea, and let me talk about the method a little bit, the main idea is that you look at text and you look for 3 levels in the text. You look for the
meaning in the text. You'll look for for the intertextuality, how it relates to other texts that you're reading, and then also to the social context. So discourse analysis is very often criticized for the inability to actually measure up to the real world, to the reality of things. But this critique isn't justified because, in fact, discourse analysis does contain the clause that when you're doing this, when you are pursuing this method, you are actually, you must look at how things measure up against the reality. So that's something that I also had to do. And I tried to probe into how the two establishments were framing the more tangible cooperation aspects and to cross-check the stories of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping with what was really happening. And because when it comes to the high-level signaling, I think we see it also now during the war in Ukraine, there is a lot of solidarity and a lot of support in how the leaders communicate to one another. For example, even now during Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, we saw how Vladimir Putin immediately signaled support to China and said that this is a very unjustified, and in fact, he was extremely critical of this. And it also works the other way. We saw it with Putin's invasion into Ukraine, that Chinese leadership signaled support to the Russian position on the expansion of NATO and the US as the ultimate culprit of the degrading security situation in Europe. So on one hand, we see and both countries do, in fact, refer to each other and refer to this new relationship as the best in the history of the interactions of Russia and China. So therefore, naturally, when it comes to the international relations events, the question is this sort of a dragon bear? This is not my word, by the way. I did not come up with this, but that is what people ask very often. Is it, in fact, a dragon bear emerging? Is it a new alliance? Is it a new military entente of Russia and China? And something that, in fact, is the new reality of the century. And that is why what was very interesting was to look at these internal discourses of one country vis-a-vis each other. And that is why it was extremely interesting for me to take a look at how these countries interact, but also circumvent one another when it comes to their quote-unquote neighborhoods. And that is why I took a look at Central Asia, and that is why I also took a look at Vietnam. It was even more so interesting to examine how Russia falls back on India as in an attempt to balance China. And I do not like the word balance, and I apologize for using it because it's a very realist word, but at the same time, that is something that can be seen. For example, if we take a look at the Russian security strategy, which was adopted in 2021, what you're going to see is that they make a very specific attempt to even out the mentions of China and the mentions of India. So it's also interesting to me that on one hand, Putin is signaling this extreme friendship with Xi Jinping and with China, but on the other hand, they use every opportunity. And by the way, there's an increase in that in comparison to, for example, the 2015 strategy. So, and use every opportunity to bring in India as another significant power in Eurasia, and to underscore the special relationship that Russia has with India. So, and also, what I found was very interesting was the space frontier. Even though I'm not a space scientist, so it was extremely difficult. I had to interview a lot of colleagues to be able to write on the topic. And like to go back to what I tried to express in my difficult Chinese, apologies. What I tried to express is that I am not in favor of the Chinese-Russian alliance theory. I do not believe that Russia has pivoted towards China. I believe it has pivoted towards itself. It is closing in on itself. It is, but that does not mean that this multifaceted relationship that Russia has with China will stop growing. I think it will continue to grow and expand, looking for this perfect imbalance, because they are facing similar domestic and similar external factors. So, and I would like to say that there's one very specific, interesting part about the information spaces of both countries, and I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about it. That since the information spaces are so sealed off from one another and they have so little overlap, that when there's critique about the other country, they kind of fail to register among large numbers of the population on the other side of the border. So the information space, the story of friendship, is being dominated by reports from official news agencies. And they signal these stories that I outlined to you: the personal friendship story, the high value added cooperation story, as well as the cooperation and Eurasian connectivity story. And also, for example, COVID-19 relief in a very positive way. And even when the strategies of these two countries do not match in practice, like I already tried to demonstrate, I hope I did, such as this competing Eurasian connectivity narrative, Belt and Road and Putin's Eurasian Economic Union. In fact, the official narratives that keep the friendship together are resilient enough to smooth over these differences. What I found very interesting, in fact, is really how these stories of discontent on the other side are being kind of, a lid is being put on them. Let me just give you one example. Perhaps you know this example. It was a few years ago that a concerned parent in Blagoveshchensk, right there on the border with China, as you well know, on the other side of the Heilongjiang River, opened up a book that his child had brought home from school. And in this book, it was a history book. He saw that it said that the city where this parent and their child was living, it was in fact taken over by Russians, by these forces during the 100 Years of Humiliation from China, and those were in fact traditionally Qing Dynasty lands. Well, I'm paraphrasing, that was the idea, so that these lands were taken from China. The concerned parent was absolutely outraged and wrote a very angry letter to the Ministry of Education, saying that we should not be teaching our children here in Russia such preposterous that make them feel not at home in their own city, as though we are some kind of occupiers, as though we've done wrong by someone. That I don't want my child to study from a book like that. And I believe you can guess, or maybe you know the story. The material of the book was updated, and this particular sentence was excluded from it. This news made it to China, and perhaps you've come across, if you follow the news in mainland China, and created a very big wave of discontent among Chinese netizens for a while. But it quickly died out, and it seemed like on the Russian side, when it was reported back, these reports were kind of just, the volume was being turned down on them. And at the end of the day, stories like that don't really catch fire because they're being kind of put down to not question this friendship narrative. So that is what I say. That is what I mean when I say that the official narratives are very resilient, because they also have the support of the press. And this is for the domestic factors that I wanted to outline. Now to the international arena. Of course, the US is the common denominator. The drive to challenge the existing international system, although differently, is a common denominator. we can argue that Russia is a spoiler in a sense, because it doesn't really present a coherent vision of what to do in this new international system. They're just saying, we're not happy with this and we want more of everything Russian, but there's no vision. And we could argue that at this point in time, even though contested, but China is trying to at least present a vision. So I would say the drive to change is different, but still it is one of the parallels. There is the perception of a deteriorating security environment that both parties share. And I think this is where this leap to the conclusion that perhaps they're entering into a sort of Russia, China, NATO is being made. In fact, it's not valid, I would say. And I think that at this point, they do not need a black on white mutual defense clause to deepen this relationship, because Russia and China are very comfortable admitting not just the commonalities, but also the differences. Because actually what they're doing right now in terms of cooperation is working in one particular front. It is keeping the collective West, predominantly the United States, worried. So it is an issue, right? It is on the agenda. But I do argue that we should not forget the challenges that are shaping the relationship of these two countries. I argue that short-term gains, such as keeping the US worried, do not solve the dilemmas of long-term competition and security misgivings. I think we see that in the space frontier. Again, there's lack of trust, something that I tried to outline in the Chinese part of my talk. The lack of trust. There is mutual arrests of researchers that work, for example, on the Arctic. So there's for example, a Russian researcher who was arrested, who's right now in jail for allegedly passing secrets to his Chinese colleagues. Also, similar stories have taken place in China. So on one hand, there's a story if we should cooperate in the Arctic tech, but on the other hand, you better make sure that it doesn't look like you're selling secrets. And another thing that's a very downplayed, oftentimes, a challenge in the Russian-Chinese relationship is that, in fact, Putin is worried about too much China in the world in general. And he's also worried about too much China in the Russian Arctic and in Central Asia in particular. So it appears that the grievances that the West has been voicing over some of the practices that China has been pursuing are the same grievances that at the end of the day, internally, Russia is in other words, is also voicing. And we see very clearly that, like I mentioned, to offset China's dominance, Russia is trying to fall back on other partners in Asia, notably India. They tried with Vietnam, they failed, but still, and India, of course, is interested in doing this. Although I would have to say that the conclusion in my Indian chapter is that, in fact, they do not believe in the RIC format, neither do they fully believe in the BRICS format, because they believe that if there is a choice to be made, then Russia will side with China over India. There's another issue between these countries that should not be ignored. The fact that China globally is much more ambitious, and it does seem like, and by the way, sorry, just quickly, I want to say that when I say China and Russia, what I mean are the foreign policy actors, the foreign policy stakeholders of the countries, right? I do not personify the country. I rather mean the people behind the texts that I analyze, just to make that clear. So we see that domestically in the Chinese academic discourse, for example, there are some signals that believe that these Russian outlashes towards the West are counterproductive to international stability. And I also believe that and I've read my colleagues in China who have written about this, maybe not so explicitly, but there is an opinion. So I'm very much interested in hearing what we have to say later in the Q&A, because I'm here to learn from you and to listen to your perspectives as well. So that, in fact, Putin's invasion into Ukraine has brought a lot of discontent in China. All the support kind of aside, has brought a lot of discontent because, of course, it damaged the Chinese reputation in Ukraine. It damaged Belt and Road prospects in Europe very strongly. So that had to be reoriented. And it damaged, in general, it created instability at the end of the day. So that these such emotional outlashes, if one can use that word in the context of a war, are counterproductive also to the goals that China is trying to pursue. And interestingly, I would say that even though we do live, and that's again something that I would love to hear your perspectives on, because I'm currently not in the US, but it did seem like during the meeting in Bali, when Wang Yi met with Blinken, they talked for 5 hours. I wasn't there, so I didn't hear it, obviously. But the feeling was that during the demands and the materials that came out of it demonstrated a little bit of a leeway of China towards the US. So kind of, we're still very unhappy with A, B, C, D, but let's see if we can work on E, right? Of course, that's after Pelosi's visit. That's not going to happen for the time being. We saw how the dialogues on ecology and on mill dialogue has been suspended between China and the US now. But in that short little period of time, that seemed like an opportunity. And again, keeping that in mind, China doesn't want to be locked into the Russian worldview permanently, because it does minimize China's space of maneuver. Now, what would be good for Eurasia? What kind of level of Chinese-Russian cooperation would be good for Eurasia at large, and maybe the world and at large? When I wrote the book, I argued that it is the existing one, because, and it was a problematic point to make. I got a lot of criticism over it. Because my argument is that if these two countries have issues amongst each other, have conflicts amongst each other, then it would spell instability and extreme trouble for all of Eurasia. However, I would say that at that point, what I wrote was also that a higher degree of convergence would also not be desirable, because it would spell stronger pressure on the existing rules of the international order. And I think now, after February 24, and after the initial positions of China in the war, we do see a little bit of convergence, a higher degree of convergence than last year. So we'll see where that leads. And maybe I'll stop here and because it's I don't see the audience and I don't know how you guys are reacting. I see a couple of so yeah, the ZZZ wasn't about me. I thought somebody fell asleep listening to me. But anyway, maybe we can 这里有这个时间中国人都在睡觉啊，这个跟我没有关系。好，So if there's any questions, and maybe if there's any criticisms, and also just your feelings and your opinions that you want to voice in Chinese or English or Latvian or Russian, please do. Thank you.
Una老师是现在开始提问环节还是？
对，我们可以开始提问环节。对。
Okay, so thank you so much.
说了，我们对，现在是我们讲了半个多小时，我觉得可能够了吧。
好的。OK， 那也再次感谢这个乌娜老师给我们带来了一个非常深入的分析。 那我这边也抛砖引玉，有一些问题也是之前收集的。那可能第一个问题是跟我们比较息息相关的啊，我看其实也有人问类似的问题。我们都知道，其实乌娜老师也是一个语言学家，这个中英俄文都非常的精通。而且其实线上的我们很多的观众其实都是中国人，生活在不同的国家，所以其实语言对我们来说也是每天都要使用的工具。那我们也想听一听乌娜老师这个有精通这么多语言，从语言学上能不能给我们一些建议，就是如何把这么多语言可以就是学得更好。
好，其实我觉得这个跟我的国家有关系。我来自一个很小的国家这里有人写 You must be an American， 其实不是，但是非常感谢，这意味着我那个口音还是没有以前强，那这也好。反正我来自拉脱维亚，我们这里只有200万的人口，非常的少，所以我们这里一定要学到不少的语言，而且我自己我的这个家庭背景是我是混血，我家里讲的拉语、俄语还有立陶宛语，那这样就从小开始学语言，我觉得肯定跟你们的这个经验差不多嘛，因为我们观众其中有很多人是
华裔，对，
美国华裔，对，所以肯定也知道这个而且家里讲的肯定有英文有中文，还有可能第3种语言，对吧？就这样，我觉得我们的经验比较像。
因为其实语言也有观众问到，就说您提到的话语分析，主要您分析的是哪种语言，比例各占多少？
俄语和中文，比例的话，也不能说1比1，应该就是6比4吧。
6比4这样子 ，OK 好然后就是其实普京呢曾经表示，这其实也是算他的原话，就是中俄关系达到了一个互相信任的程度，我们并不需要军事联盟，但不排除这种可能性。然后那您认为从这个趋势来看，您觉得这个我们有可能结成这个军事联盟吗？
So it's better if I respond in English because I might not. So I believe that the signaling that the quote that you read, in fact, yes, that was before the war in Ukraine, but still that was already, I think, after 2021, right? Something like or was it 2019 when they signed the 70 years of the agreement?
Yes.
Of course, for Putin, it's very important to signal China's support. It makes him look stronger, and it makes his country look stronger. And that is not an easy task for him because it's a country with only 146, if I'm not mistaken, million people, which is nothing, right, for a country this size. And as we see with a country that has taken pride in its military for decades, and yet its military is not as strong as they were believed to be. So for him to signal this friendship and this almost alliance-like relationship, and not just for him, by the way, also his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has said the same thing, playing with the word allies. Playing with the word союзники, which in Russian basically means can also mean informal ties, not just an alliance. But I think what is very telling is how reluctant the Chinese side has been to pick up this story and this narrative, to echo it. If we look at how Wang Yi has responded almost every single time when Lavrov or Putin have said this, is with China does not 结盟. China does not enter into alliances, which again, we know is not true because China has an alliance with North Korea. And it's been it's not like, so saying that China does not, of course, it's a historic situation, we all know, but it's interesting how immediately the reaction is that China does not, that we do not need an alliance. So kind of a pushback to this Russian framing.
Understand. Okay.
That's why I do not believe that. Again, another issue, of course, is there going to be military support? I do not believe in strong military above kind of visible military support to Russia from China. It's just that it's too expensive. It makes no sense. At the same time, and I think China's made a very clear point
of not helping Russians circumvent the sanctions.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
even also, if we take a look at the speeches of Chinese top leadership during the April 1st EU-China summit, which was a virtual summit, we also see the EU side keeps saying, why are you supporting Russia? You're basically supporting, like, you should do more not to, you should do more to tell Russians not to stop this war. And the Chinese side is saying, that is not our war. This is not we are neutral. We hope that both sides sit down. And so again, this very strong reluctance to be tied into Putin's worldview and Putin's crusades. So I do not believe in an outward military support towards Russia. Having said that, we do see that on an ad hoc basis, there has been some coordination. We have seen the flyovers during Biden's visit a couple of months ago with jets of Russia and China joint military exercises to kind of a drill together. Of course, that's posturing. We understand that this is posturing. Still, we do not know, perhaps on some more less visible or ad hoc issue, there could be cooperation.
Okay, thank you for explanation. And OK， 有一个问题是，俄罗斯在苏联解体之后，是不是已经放弃了社会主义的体制？我把这个收到这个上面。
OK。
那俄罗斯人民对中国的社主义体制怎么看？会不会觉得中国在走苏联的老路，在错误的道路上？
这个问得非常好。This question is excellent. In fact, it has more to do, of course, with domestic ideology. So I will try my best to respond. This is not necessarily my research topic, but I will try and hope to respond to this. So in Russia, I think there is, of course, there is right now kind of a romantic rebirth of an idea of how, the golden age of the Soviet Union, how strong and respected it was. This nostalgia is quite widespread, interestingly, among the 30-year-olds who never lived in the Soviet Union. But still, there is this emotion. So perhaps they're not exactly calling and they're not wanting to bring back the ideology, the full-scale ideology of this Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, they do feel that a certain part of population, let's say, does feel that it was a time when Russia was respected internationally. And so how does Russia, so in that sense, it's not the 90s anymore. The 90s were the time of an allergy towards everything communist, right? A time of wanting to shake off that heritage and the memory of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, to the second part of the question, how does that then concern how Russians view China and Chinese political system? First of all, they do not believe that the current Chinese political system is the same as what they had in the Soviet Union. And it's not, of course, right? After reform and opening up, it's just not. Secondly, we also know that China has institutes that are learning and studying the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mistakes that were made, and the policies that have led to it, including, for example, the ethnic policies. I've spoken to these colleagues. I've spoken to people who work at these. That was obviously 5, 6, maybe 7 years ago, so not recently, but I've spoken to them when they were still available and when I still had access to them. And they were, and I was an interesting person to speak to because I come from the Baltic countries, and they're one of so their questions had to do with the role of Baltic countries in the collapse of the Soviet Union. But that goes to show that the Chinese system is just different, and the Russians are aware of it, that there are elements, of course, that ring back to the Soviet era. But at the same time, there's very different policies. And I was very surprised when I was talking to a colleague who is originally from Russia, and he pointed out that he believes that, and he's also a discourse analyst, so we had a blast, as you can imagine, discussing all these things. So it's a very nerdy way to spend your time, I understand, and yet. So and he made a point. He said, well, in fact, what I see now is a neoliberal discourse coming out of Chinese political leadership. For example, another example, I'm putting together an edited volume now on bringing together different colleagues who work on Chinese political discourse analysis. And one of them has submitted a chapter saying that the discourse on the poor in China has nothing to do with socialist discourse. It's a neoliberal discourse of being responsible for your own fate, in a sense, right? So if you're poor, it's kind of, it has something to do with your decisions also, right? Not the system. So I think we should not ignore the fact that the strong presence of such interesting, as my colleague said, neoliberal trends as well in the Chinese political discourse. And that, of course, is completely different from what the Russians had in the late Soviet Union.
Okay.
And of course, planned economy as well. That is something that China has been moving away from, and state-owned companies and all, it has its issues, obviously, right? But it's a different system, absolutely. And the Russians are very well aware of it.
Okay. And next question is also a bit interesting. Like, 普京在国人在我们中国人眼中其实是一个硬汉形象，可能也是因为一些 PR 的文章给我们这种感觉。那欧洲人是怎么看普京的？
我找一下这个。好，我
Okay,
找不到，但
I just
没关
put it
系，
on the screen.
我听懂，没事，我这个OK， 谢谢。普京在中国，对，欧洲人 when it comes to Europeans, it's different, and I just spent a few months as a research scholar in Germany, so I can tell you that the opinions across Europe differ, right? Because Europe is really a very diverse set of opinions. Having said that, of course, I think the attack itself, the attack on Ukraine, has, of course, damaged Putin's image.
Yeah.
But not just that. I would say that already the war in Georgia in 2008 was kind of an issue, but still, regardless of that, Russia got the rights for FIFA, for the World Cup, and there was an understanding that perhaps still a dialogue can be had and some appeasement is in place. Then 2014 happened, Crimea happened. And again, countries closer to Russia, including the Baltic states, Poland, countries that have certain experience, let's say, with Russia, were worried and were saying, this is not okay. This is an infringement on a country's sovereignty. But countries that did not have this experience and that do, I would say, even idealize Russia a little bit and kind of see Russia as the outweigher of the United States in a sense. So not just countries, I would say, rather maybe political forces, right? Politicians, because every country has different political forces and has a spectrum of these opinions. But this opinion was present that, in fact, maybe it still is. I mean, it's bad, but it's still their business, right? And so the World Cup happened. Some governments ignored it and boycotted. Some didn't. Robbie Williams sang a song. Everybody was happy. Russia was kind of again being imagined, and Putin himself, right, was being imagined as this, as yes, a strong man, but at the same time, maybe we can negotiate with him. Having said that, of course, there's always information about the crackdowns on the information, accessibility of media, LGBT plus, all these domestic issues that Putin has made a part of his approach to, I don't know, restoring some kind of a Russian value system, whatever that might mean. But I would say that, of course, after February 24, 2022, idealizing Putin is really hard. Even for the die-hard fans who believed that buying Russian gas and getting dependent on from Russian gas is a good solution. It is indeed a very interesting regional dynamic. And of course, in my country, just to give you an example, because I don't know if you're ever going to visit my country, but a bit of a visual, yeah, you're welcome. A bit of a visual example. across the street from the Russian embassy, the protests never stop. And so across the street, there is a medical museum. And this medical museum has a massive mural, massive picture of Putin's face as a kind of a zombie skeleton, bloody zombie skeleton, who is this terrible creature from hell. And that, I think that picture, in fact, signifies how a lot of people in the region view him as a politician and as a president of the country that we're neighboring with.
Okay.
So very different from
Yes.
different from the Chinese perspective, and this is great. And thank you so much for the opportunity to listen to your perspectives.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for Abby's question. And next one, I think this is the question all of us really want to learn from you. 您认为俄乌战争给中俄关系带来的影响？
Yes, I think that the war has. At first, it wasn't clear. Because China really waited. It didn't come out immediately with a statement, right? The Chinese top diplomats did not say anything for quite some time. But then I think one of the reasons that showed that there is this, so when in my presentation, I talked about the common factors that are also outside factors that are the worldview that is pushing these two countries together. And I think the joint statement that Putin and Xi Jinping came out with during the Olympics in Beijing already, and that was right before the war, that was what, February 7th or 8th? I'm sorry if I don't remember, I'm terrible with dates. It already contained this language of blaming NATO for deterioration of security in Europe. And then when China did come out after the invasion, did come out with a statement, it also contained a lot of the same language. So I think that it did. This shows us that, of course, China, I do not believe that China is fully on board. Like I said, Russia's invasion into Ukraine creates some very real problems politically, economically, image-wise for China. But the fact that still Chinese top diplomats are willing to demonstrate this rhetoric support, and sometimes even the state media went as far as to say that the Russian claims about the biolabs in Ukraine were true. That was shocking to me. That shows that there is that the relationship might have become stronger as a result of this. But this is a question that I do not have an answer to. We actually had a big debate with a couple of colleagues, and that was online, with a couple of colleagues, excellent colleagues, who also study the same thing that I study and who are smarter than me and who have more experience than me. And we never really came to a conclusion because it's probably too early to tell. But I would still say that, yes, Russia's invasion and China's signaling, and then also Russia's signal vis-a-vis China, is demonstrating a stronger bond between the countries. I wonder, what do you think? If there's a commentary from someone in the audience in terms of your vision, I would be very happy to hear it. How would you answer this question?
OK， 那刚才乌娜老师也跟我们讲了他对于这个的观点，但是我们知道其实他没有一个 conclusion， 因为其实事态还是在不断的发展当中，所以说其实态度也在不断的变化。那我本人是在加拿大，那其实我们加拿大的很多的在加拿大的中国人对此其实也有不一样的看法，对，所以我们也欢迎大家有什么看法也可以给我们再打到公屏上，我们一起来深入的讨论。那下一个呢，其实也有在问这个，我打到公屏上，这个问题其实也是我在之前讲座之前收集大家的问题的时候，很多人也有这个问题，就是关于邻国的问题。因为这个就是原话是普京总统或者俄罗斯国民希望恢复俄罗斯的帝国的历史版图或者势力范围，譬如邻国的俄语区。因为这个也是之前其实有很多类似的问题，都是邻国的担心，我们可能也有来自一些邻国的这些生活在那边的朋友，对，也是希望为我们解答一下这一块。
Yes, thank you. So again, this will be from my regional perspective, and also from my ethnic perspective as half Russian and as a person who reads a lot of, who for work and for research, reads a lot of Russian materials. I do think that it is a valid estimation that Putin does want to go down in history as Vladimir the Great, to quote some of my colleagues. He does want to bring back the empire, but I do not think that this means that he will somehow have any issues with China while doing this. I think his eyes are on Europe, including my country, which was a part of the empire for a while and then was independent between the wars and then was occupied again and made part of the Soviet Union, basically, and then independent again in 1991. So the fact, and this is why I have a problem with the argument that it's NATO's expansion that caused instability in Europe. Because the way we see it in our region is that, in fact, our countries were begging to be admitted into NATO because of this perception that Russia is going to be strong again one day and they're going to want these lands. And this prophecy it is coming true, because when it was the 90s and when, like I said, there was sort of a will to push away everything Soviet related, it was a window of opportunity for these smaller countries that Russia viewed as part of the empire once to reclaim their independence. But it was quite clear that this period is not going to last very long, and that you need a story to keep such a diverse country, multi-ethnic country, not a rich country, right? In terms of quality of life, not a rich country, together. And what is better than a story of reuniting and recreating something great, such as the empire? So I do believe, and I do believe that looking at how Ukraine is being portrayed in Russia as not a real country, Ukrainian is not believed to be a real language, but rather an uneducated dialect of Russian, which is terrible. But it sounds colonial, and it is. And the attitude towards all these countries, including even Finland, that has not been part of the empire since 1918, right? That won the war against that won the war in 1939 against the Russians. So I believe that this issue of recreating the empire is Putin's crusade. I think NATO is a deterrent power that is not letting him go quite as far. And I think he reckons with that. I hope that he reckons with that. And I think that he's not alone in this thinking. He has a very significant public support to this imperial thinking. There's also, of course, an opposition. Of course, there's many people who disagree. Of course, there's a lot of intelligentsia that find it outrageous and crazy and preposterous. But let's not lie to ourselves. He is not alone in this mindset.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's why some people say like 特权者不愿意放弃自己的特权哈。And next one is 请问乌娜教授，现在的俄罗斯继承了苏联的哪些政治元素？中国一直认为自己是社会主义国家，在一定程度上存在与俄罗斯争论谁是正统继承者的问题。这个其实跟刚才的问题有一点点像，就是关于中国现在的这个体制。那这边感兴趣的是俄罗斯的国内是怎么看这个问题？
我再看一遍，没有
OK 好，
看得很清楚。那俄罗斯，就是说，在俄罗斯现在有哪些苏联的政治元素，对吧？还是中国一直认为，
其实就是关于苏联是社会主义，它苏联解体之后呢，其实 俄罗斯跟中国他们都有一点继承。大家感兴趣的是俄罗斯继承了哪些，那中国继承了哪些，到底谁才是真正的这个苏联当时这些政治元素的一个继承者，然后俄罗斯人怎么会看这个问题？因为我们可能会知道中国人怎么看这个问题，但我们可能想知道俄罗斯他们怎么想，就是俄罗斯的人民这个的看法。
俄罗斯这个继承方，the idea of legacy, of the Soviet legacy in Russia is not ideological, but rather in terms of power, might, influence, and providing a second center of power globally. So when you ask what people miss, they will not tell you that they miss not having products in the stores that they cannot buy, right? So there's nothing you can buy because of the planned economy. But they will tell you that they miss the feeling when the first human being in space was a Soviet citizen. So in terms of legacy, I think there's a disconnect in the Russian mind. There is one part of this legacy that had to do with the quality of life that is being ignored, and that had to do with the ideas, with the ideology of communism. That is something people do not believe in seriously. But the other part of this legacy, the idea of technical superiority that the Soviet Union heavily invested in, and that did put them on top in terms of space, in terms of innovation. The idea of, let's say, also social services, also the availability of education, the availability of healthcare. These ideas are something where Russia feels like it has the legacy of the Soviet Union, and it's carrying it on. But when it comes to the common, so sorry if I move from the question a little bit, I think it's very interesting. The solidarity, the things that bring Russia and China together are in fact stemmed in the short period of the Sino-Soviet friendship before the death of Stalin in 1953. So starting from 1949 and up to 1950, okay, let's say late 50s, right, before the split. And a lot of these memories are rooted in the songs, right? So I've seen Chinese and Russian families meet, not being able to communicate, but they know the same revolutionary songs, which they each know in their own language, and that brings them together. So in terms of these very emotional symbols, let's say symbols that signal legacies, that is where the commonalities lie. But let's not forget that also the root of many issues in today's Russian-Chinese relations lie in the same period, because the perception in Russia was that they were the leading partner, the teacher, the innovator, the investor into China, the big brother that the Chinese should be thankful to. Everybody remembers the Soviet specialists that went to work, in Chinese companies, trying to innovate, to modernize, that kind of thing. But now the situation is almost inversed. Now China is the rich one, the one that can dictate its rules. And I don't know if we can use, maybe perhaps some of my colleagues apply also the notion of racism here, of cultural superiority, this perception in the Russian culture that you cannot just have somebody who's Chinese and that they're better than you as a culture. That's impossible. Like, how can that be? So I think that, and I'm simplifying here, of course, but I'm sure that each and every person who has Russian heritage will agree that there is some level of cultural superiority vis-a-vis China in Russia, in some circles, which is, of course, extremely wrong. So I think that, to go back, sorry for the long answer, to go back to the point that this period of loved friendship that was tying together the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China in its early days, that many Russians look back to as the golden age of post-war friendship, in fact, also creates some very strong symbols that the Russians have to overcome, including the sense of their own superiority and the relationship of China being the client, so kind of a client-patron relationship with China, if they want to overcome the main issue in the relationship that I outlined, the lack of trust in terms of populations.
Okay, I understand. Okay, thank you. 我们今天的问题很多啊，看来大家都非常的踊跃，然后也有这个观众在说慢慢来，没有关系啊，我们不管是用哪种语言，我们慢慢来都可以。接下来一个问题呢，这个可能也是跟您比较息息相关，因为刚刚也你也来自波罗的海三国。那观众的问题是，波罗的海三国对俄罗斯的态度是否有区别？感觉立陶宛要比较强硬一点。
我们的观众对我们这个地区的一些方面了解得很深啊。So there, in fact, if you zoom out, there is not much difference in how the three Baltic states view Russia specifically. I would also put Poland in there, right? So kind of the three Baltic states plus Poland. In terms of kind of major lines, it's very similar. Lithuania stands out if you zoom in a little bit because their approach vis-a-vis Russia is a part of the wider anti-authoritarian foreign policy that the current government, led by the Conservatives and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is also a grandson of a very famous value politician in Lithuania, are pursuing. So this anti-authoritarian approach means that we are not saying that Russians are a threat just because they could attack us, but we are saying they're a threat because ideologically and in terms of the political system, they are an authoritarian state. They're not a democratic state. So rather than a realist approach where you say, we're small, they're big, we share a border with them, they have a lot of things that go boom, and they can and then they have this idea of taking back the empire, so we should be worried. Rather than saying that, they're saying we stand against all authoritarian countries, be it Russia, be it Belarus, right? Lithuania is very strong on Belarus. All three Baltic states are, but Lithuania is kind of the mouthpiece of the policy, and China. So that is what puts Lithuania apart from Estonia and Latvia. Whereas Estonia and Latvia do kind of agree with the same points, but do not approach in their foreign policy necessarily, do not approach this problem from a democracy versus autocracy angle, but rather approach this from a, what can they do to us? And from a values perspective, right? From a human rights perspective. So I'd say that the Lithuanian position is further than the EU general position in criticizing these autocratic states, whereas the Latvian and Estonian position falls pretty squarely into a joint Brussels EU position.
Okay, we understand more. Yeah. So the next question is, 对近期的这个访台啊，这个我们都比较关心的这个台湾问题呢，突然就让各国的关系又紧张了一下，进入一个剑拔弩张的状态。俄罗斯对此的态度是什么样子的
？Yes, so Russia and Vladimir Putin immediately jumped on the opportunity and expressed solidarity and support to China, to People's Republic of China, saying that Pelosi's visit was kind of a slap in the face of 1.5 billion, 1.4 billion of Chinese people. So again, and I think this is where we see this something that we talked about a little bit earlier about how Putin and his foreign policy apparatus signal the kinship with China and signal in order to increase his own leverage internationally, signals how his goals and his worldview, in fact, is aligned with Beijing. And some see it as a sign of weakness, in fact. I have not written about this specifically yet, so I'm relying on what my colleagues have written, but we definitely can, I think, because this was a very fiery reaction from Putin. It was a speech, right? It wasn't just like, a two-line statement. It was like really fiery. It was made to create ripples. So take it or leave it, but I would say it is in fact a sign of weakness as well. Trying to really put himself closer to the Chinese position, hoping perhaps that China will in turn move closer to his position on Ukraine.
OK， 大家有问题的话还可以持续问啊，因为从现在开始这几个就是我的问题，这个是我的名字，然后因为我可能觉得打在上面乌娜老师比较方便一点，所以我把我的问题也直接打到上面了。大家有问题还可以持续的问，就是这是我看到的数据是中国政府发布的，并且在很多官网上面都有，就关于这个中俄贸易在上半年增长了 28.9%。因为其实疫情期间，就是你也知道，很多时候其实我们现在还是有一点点闭关锁国的状态，包括我们现在还没有看到中国人出来旅游，还有一些贸易和一些大公司的撤出，所以我们其实当时是很担心说走向一个贸易的闭关锁国的这样一个状态。但是我看中国政府发布的这个数据，是不是能说明中俄的贸易没有受影响，反而它走向一个更好的往来呢？
So I think, of course, the increase. So I'm not an economist, so please forgive me if my analysis is a little bit, unprofessional. So I do follow colleagues who conduct analysis on the Chinese markets and on the latest information. I will say this: of course, the increase in trade with Russia has to do with sanctions. So on one hand, of course, China, like I said, is not helping Russia circumvent anything. But on the other hand, of course, when it comes to the certain products, it does increase. It kind of naturally increases China as the southern partner in terms of the Russian consumer. Secondly, I believe that a lot of this, I don't have the materials right now. I will spend, it will take time away from the conversation if I look for them, but I believe that natural resources form a very significant part of this, of the trade balance sheet between Russia and China now. Russia has increased its exports towards China. And by the way, the exports have increased, but the prices are quite low. So that speaks to what some analysts call China's opportunism, that in fact, on one hand, rhetorically, China is supporting Russia, not fully, but is supporting on the story of US being to blame for Ukraine. But on the other hand, is taking advantage. Business is business when it comes to importing Russian low value added energy resources. So I would say these two factors are what my colleagues tend to name as the main factors between the increase in Russian-Chinese trade. But of course, also perhaps there is an element of just generic increase, that even though you did mention that, of course, the situation is still, it's still a locked country, and there's a lot of, the freedom of movement, and because of COVID has not been restored. But still, you cannot argue that we are in a much better and a much more optimistic situation than we were in 2020, in late 2020. So perhaps it also has to do with individual consumer behavior and just some sort of optimism that COVID is retreating, perhaps.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question here. Said, OK， 有文章说，普京的这次对乌克兰的特殊行动是受到社会的大俄罗斯主义这一理论的影响。俄罗斯的学术界对社经这个理论怎么看？ 对，就镀金的大俄罗斯主义。
哦，镀金这个词我不了解，对不起，我查一下。镀金Dugin 明白了，是这个俄罗斯的一个it's a philosopher. Yes, sorry, Dugin. Gotcha. It's late. Sorry. Yes, Dugin is one crazy person. No exaggeration. As a scholar, I shouldn't be saying this, but his teachings, his writings are nothing short of absolute geopolitical insanity. And there are indeed, yes, report, and he does have, his writings do have sway. He does also have a very strong esoteric side to what he writes, but there's also this idea of, of big Russia that has indeed created a big that has influenced Putin's ideas. Yeah, he is being called as the ideological father of Putin's ideas. Now to the second part, 俄罗斯的学术内在镀金的这个理论怎么看? Okay, so first of all, the Dugin is not I'm not a part of the Russian academic world so much, so something just that I will share with you what I find interesting. It's very hard to speak your mind in Russia today because it's a heavily censored country, so it's hard to publish. My colleagues cannot really publish things when they, when you don't agree fully, then it's about nuance. So we cannot really expect a representation of what the Russian academics think or don't think based on the publications. Having said that, in conversations, of course, with my colleagues, you do see that people do find Dugin's writing to be, like I said, esoteric, pseudo-historical. So he manipulates history in his writings. Nationalistic. It's pure ethnic nationalism and the idea of the Slavonic superiority. It's crazy. I'm telling you, don't read him. And I think the more intelligent people in the Russian academia, no matter if they support Putin's war or they don't support it, do believe that Dugin is of course not a scientist, not a scientific, not a weighted historical view on how things should be. Having said that, of course, interestingly, he does get a lot of media time. He does get a lot of interviews. He's published a lot. He is very well known. So that goes to show you that he's not ostracized, right? But I would say that from a strictly 学术 perspective, you cannot take him seriously. And my colleagues in Russia do not take him seriously, I would hope.
Okay. It's not a scientist, just a philosopher.
Yes. But at the same time, he does use a lot of, he uses a lot of historical examples, he kind of manipulates these things. So he does create, and he speaks about normative issues as philosophers very well should, but at the same time, there is a lot of, basically it is, I would say in fact, he's a fascist. If you read his writings, I've done it for work, not for fun, but I've done it in Russian. He is a fascist. Absolutely.
OK. 我们今天时间有限哈，可能就是最后2个问题，如果大家还有的话，可以就是抓紧时间。那接下来这个问题呢是2022年2月普京总统访华期间， 两国元首发表了中俄关于新时代国际关系和全球可持续发展的联合声明，然后为我们专业的解读一下。这份声明呢，其实中国政府还是非常的重视。我看到在中国的各大官网上和所有的主流媒体都有非常强调这个事情，这也是截至目前为止最新的一份两国元首的一个声明。所以说，我们可能想听一下您对此的解读。
当时我at that when the joint statement came out, this is the one in the Olympic one, right? We're talking about the same one, yes. It did in fact contain new language. So of course the profile of the statement was so high that it was reported on not just in the Russian and Chinese media, but it was reported on globally. Because it contained, because it contained these signals of alignment, I would say, regarding it didn't just speak about the great level of relations that the two countries have reached, but it contained a joint analysis of the international security situation, pointing fingers at a joint adversary, the United States and NATO at large. And it did present a joint kind of a worldview. So we both believe this is how things are right now. So from that perspective, it was a very interesting document, even more so. But I think it's not just the document that caused, and it's very interesting to me that you say that in China also it was spoken of a lot. But I think the most interesting part of this document was in fact not its text, but its legacy. Because just a few weeks later, Russia crossed the border of Ukraine, and immediately the signaling from the Russian side was as if Xi Jinping knew about this and was okay with it. So, and this is something that I do not know because I don't have that level of access, obviously, but the question is, during that meeting, during the closed part of this meeting, how much did Putin tell Xi? Did he say that was let's take a step back and remember it was already the time when the Russian army was at Ukraine's border. It was the time when the American intelligence services was screaming left and right that they're going to attack, that they have this information, and the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was very vehemently denying it, if you remember, right? They were very much denying saying, no, we're not going to attack. And actually, Ukraine was also, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, was also making these statements saying that, no, it's not going to happen. Stop spreading panic. But, so the question is, during this meeting, obviously, it was discussed in some level. So how much did Xi know? And the perception was almost like the Russian posturing and Russian kind of, again, to go back to show that, China's got our back, that kind of Putin's old motif, was as if they had okayed it. But I can't help but wonder, to me, I mean, we remember that China did not withdraw Chinese citizens. Was it 60,000 or so in Ukraine until later? So they did not evacuate until the war had already begun. So that's one signal that I do not believe that Xi Jinping was informed on the full scale of Putin's plan. I would believe that perhaps he was informed to the extent that he believed that Putin will try to take Donbass and maybe make a land bridge to Crimea. So, but I do not believe that the president of China was okay with a full-scale, old-school, kinetic army invasion. Because again, not because of values or not because of sovereignty, not because of that, but because it did interfere with China's interest in Ukraine and in the region. So to me, this document is interesting, not because of what it contains, but because of what it signifies. Putin later, 2 weeks later, used this document to almost show we're attacking Ukraine and Chinese president is supporting us, which again, as we know, is not true, right? But that was the perception of Russian posturing. And I wonder, what about the Chinese media? If you follow, what was the reaction? Did they make any connection between this document and the invasion then?
Of course, no. In 主流媒体，当然他们不能这么报道。但是我也知道一些其实民间的自媒体，因为现在其实中国的自媒体也非常发达，其实也有自媒体这么看这个问题。只不过主流媒体不能这么去报道，所以就说明在很多的民众之间其实也是这么想的。对。
Okay, 谢谢. Thank you. It's very valuable to me, and I'm very honored that I have the opportunity to. I wish I could speak less and hear you guys more, because it's
But we wish to hear more from you. That's why. But it's okay. Like, 在这个视频我们直播结束之后，因为这个视频会被发到我们的 YouTube 的频道，那包括也会发到中国的一些就是频道去看，所以有些人可能会有更多的一些 comment， 到时候我们也可以再给您分享，看看大家对于您今天很多的这个想法的一些交流。那如果大家没有更多的问题呢，我们今天也是非常荣幸在很短的时间内听到了非常多的 valuable 的资讯那可能也是我觉得是您强大的语言学和一个政治学的背景，可以让我们有一个深入的了解关于中俄关系。那可能不少人认为在自媒体的渠道更迭的信息碎片化的时代不需要这个访谈节目，但是今天我们也觉得跟Una教授这样一个深度的访谈，让我们更多的了解到这个学术研究的魅力，也希望大家持续的关注谷雨书院、探富读书会，还有我们的一家出版社。再次感谢Una老师，感谢各位协作方感谢我们所有的观众。那我们下一次的节目再见。Una老师再见。
谢谢，再见。再见。
Una老师已经下线了是吗？好的，
是吧？
谢谢各位老师，谢谢你们的支持，谢谢。
哪里，非常感谢，非常感谢，
很完美。老师，我们回头再见。
好，谢谢，拜拜。
拜拜。
谢谢大家，谢谢伊利亚。